The 1920s would end abruptly on October 29, 1929, when the stock market collapsed and millions of Americans found themselves unemployed and homeless. The prosperity of the 1920s would disappear as the United States suffered through the worst economic downturn in its history. 25% of Americans would find themselves unemployed, banks would run out of money, and the Hoover administration responded with the laissez-faire ideology from the Gilded Age. It's America during the Great Depression. As the countries of Europe struggled to recover from World War I, the United States would emerge as the economic leader in the world. And as American production increased, so did American wages. The average income for an American increased by 35% during the 1920s. With the economy doing well, Americans were inundated with advertisements for goods that would shape American culture. The car became a symbol of the 1920s. The ad seen here boasts of a car that can get 25 miles to the gallon, get up to 58 miles an hour, and go from 5 to 25 in 8 seconds. Not impressive by today's standards, but unbelievable in the 1920s. Like today, celebrities would be used to sell products. Babe Ruth here endorsing Red Rock Cola. There were products designed to make people's lives easier that seem ridiculous, like this metal thumb-sucking prevention device, no different from things like the Slap Chop, Flex Seal, or Miracle Socks we see in those commercials today. There were ads that targeted different generations, like this Grape Nuts advertisement. Adults liked it because it was healthy. Kids found it to be swell because it tasted good. There were ads for things that actually improved people's lives, like the radio, and ads that were targeted towards women for products like a vacuum. During the 1920s, American businesses produced more, and Americans bought more things made in America because of high protective tariffs that made foreign goods more expensive. To pay for these goods, consumers started buying things on credit. Even if you couldn't afford that car, radio, or vacuum, as the sign there says, just say charge it and it would be yours. As a result of this credit, many Americans would go into debt and would soon not be able to pay it back when the economy collapsed. When he accepted the Republican nomination for president on August 11, 1928, Herbert Hoover said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in the sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." Less than a year later, Herbert Hoover's prediction would seem ridiculous. The Great Depression was the biggest economic downturn in American history, dwarfing the panics of 1819, 1837, and 1893 in its impact on the American economy. Millions of Americans would lose their jobs and savings in an economic depression that would last for more than a decade. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, when the American stock market crashed, marked the start of the Great Depression. Americans had a significant amount of money in the stock market by 1929. Many made investments with borrowed money on stocks that they were led to believe were more valuable than they really were. This over-speculation played a major role in the stock market crashing. More people investing meant more people borrowed money on credit, and in turn, banks would invest people's money in the stock market. And as businesses started to slow down, there was less and less money in the market. And as businesses failed, so did the stock market. And when the market collapsed, banks ran out of money. And when the banks had no money, so did the people who had put their money in the bank. This money was gone and would not be coming back. By 1932, stocks were worth 10% of what they were worth in 1929. So when we look at the causes of the Great Depression, we start with the stock market crash. Millions lost their savings. They tried to get their money out, but it was gone, and people stopped investing. By 1932, the stock market was at a lower level than it had been before World War I, 15 years earlier. But the stock market crash is not the only cause of the Great Depression. There was an uneven distribution of wealth. The rich were getting richer, and the middle and lower class Americans were getting poorer as wages did not continue to increase at the same rate as the cost of living. This meant that most Americans could not buy as much or pay back the debts they owed. And this consumer debt that I mentioned earlier was another cause. Companies sold goods on credit, and by 1929, a large percentage could not afford to make the payments. Another cause of the Great Depression was the lack of action from the Federal Reserve Board, which was established as the central banking system for the United States under Woodrow Wilson. The inaction by the Fed led to less money in circulation and many Americans pulling their money out of banks. These bank runs were seen across the country as more and more people pulled their money out of banks. The banks were forced to close. Overproduction was another cause of the Great Depression. As American factories produced more and American consumers started buying less, companies found themselves with large stockpiles of goods that they could not sell. This led to companies laying off employees. And one of the reasons why they could not sell these stockpiles overseas was because of high protective tariffs. The Tariff Act of 1930, which is better known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, was the highest protective tariff in American history. Let's remember that the purpose of a protective tariff is to protect American industries. But as a result of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, Europeans implemented retaliatory tariffs on American goods. These tariffs on American goods made it very difficult for American companies to sell their goods in Europe. The impact of the Great Depression was far-reaching. In 1929, the unemployment rate was just over 3%, but millions of Americans were unemployed and found themselves homeless during the Great Depression. By 1933, unemployment reached 25%, 13 million Americans, and this did not include farmers. Millions sought assistance from private charities and from the limited public relief systems. Others took to the road to find work like nomads. As you look at these images going forward, notice the looks on the faces of each individual. Hoovervilles was the name given to the towns of homeless Americans that popped up during the Great Depression. Hoover blankets was the name given to newspapers that many Americans had to use as blankets. These Hoovervilles were a sign of how desperate many Americans were during the Great Depression. As you can see in the picture on the top left, hard times are still hoovering over us. Many Americans did not agree with the policies of the Hoover administration. Underemployment was another impact, as many Americans were forced to work for less money or to do work that they were seemingly overqualified for. Notice the man in the suit on the right selling apples. As fewer people were able to buy food, and as European countries started being able to produce their own food, farm prices fell dramatically during this time period. Between 1929 and 1932, 400,000 people lost their farms as they could not pay their debt. The Great Depression also led to dramatic cuts in factory production. Demand for goods decreased as the economy collapsed, resulting in 50% less goods being produced in American factories. Less goods being produced meant fewer Americans working in factories. The American financial system collapsed during the Great Depression, with more than 5,000 banks closing, which accounted for about 20% of the banks in the country at the time. This led to foreclosures on people's homes as banks attempted to get more money. Also, some 10 million savings accounts were wiped out. As more and more Americans lost everything and became increasingly desperate, there was political unrest. Many Americans became more militant. By 1934, there were 1.5 million workers on strike. And in June 1922, over 20,000 unemployed veterans marched on Washington, D.C., asking Congress to make an immediate payment of a bonus they were owed from their service in World War I. Congress had approved the bonus in 1924, but the money wasn't to be paid until 1945. This bonus army, as it was known, built camps around Washington, D.C., and after Congress rejected their appeal, President Herbert Hoover ordered the National Guard and the U.S. Army to remove these American veterans. As you can see in the image there, American troops were moving veterans from Washington, D.C. who were seeking money. Desperate times call for desperate measures. For farmers, the issues were compounded by a period of severe dust storms in the Midwest and Southwest that led to severe drought and a significant amount of farmland being unfarmable. This was the Dust Bowl. The images here show what farmers had to deal with alongside dropping prices and mounting debt. As a result of the Dust Bowl, around 1 million families would lose their farms between 1930 and 1934, and they would pack up their cars and head for California, where there they were hoping to find farm or factory work. The plight of these farmers and their struggles in California is the source of John Steinbeck's classic novel, The Grapes of Wrath. The president at the start of the Great Depression was Herbert Hoover, who, like his predecessors, Warren G. Harding, who was the president who followed Woodrow Wilson, and Calvin Coolidge, believed in a laissez-faire approach to dealing with business. The Republican presidents during the 1920s utilized the same approach as those presidents during the Gilded Age. They argued that it was best for the government to stay out of the economy. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Hoover believed that the economy would fix itself and did nothing. Eventually, Hoover realized that action was required as the economy continued to collapse, and he called on Congress to cut taxes and to put Americans to work on public works projects. One of these projects would result in the Hoover Dam. The Federal Farm Board bought up excess crops and stored them to help stabilize the prices for farmers, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation led to the government providing emergency loans to banks, railroads, and insurance companies to help boost the economy. Ultimately, Hoover's response was ineffective, as these measures had little to no impact on the Depression. Hoover had waited too long to act, and his actions did not do enough. But it would change the way that the government dealt with the economy. In spite of the Depression, there were many movies that came out during the 1930s. Whether it was the story of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, Dorothy's journey through Oz and The Wizard of Oz, the life of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the story of a giant ape brought to New York City from Skull Island that was killed defending the film's heroine in King Kong, these movies and many others offered an escape from the reality that was American life during the Great Depression. If only for 2 hours, Americans were able to forget their issues and be transported to another place through these films. Let's close the show by considering the election of 1932. In that election, the people would reject Hoover's approach and elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, to lead America in a new direction. And in his inaugural address on March 4, 1933, he said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. Things would be different with Roosevelt's New Deal for the American people. We'll look at that next time. But until then, good night, Albuquerque."